When I was a child, I loved stories, fairy tales and folk tales and fables and fantasies. And I know I'm not alone. What young child, after all, does not love a great story? These kids' stories play an important role in a society as well. To perpetuate social codes and cultural and moral values, stories essentially tell us where we come from. And as you know, many kids' stories inevitably come to a moral of the story. And after hearing and reading dozens, hundreds, thousands of stories, we get used to looking for the moral or the message. But as we get older, the stories tend to be different. Take the curious incident of the dog in the nighttime, for instance. What is the moral of that story? Don't investigate things when your dad tells you not to. The thing is, when we approach a novel like Curious Incident, looking for the moral or the message, we may end up finding limited insight. The same is true for House on Mango Street, American Born Chinese, and Sophie's World. Why? Well, I have a hypothesis. Are there times in your life when an adult or an authority tells you to do something, but you don't do it? Why is that? To some extent, that is developmental. In adolescence, we continue to become ourselves, and this may involve differentiating ourselves from those we come from. You may find yourself questioning things you've always taken for granted. You may reject ideas that you have always taken for granted. That's the point. It's a common phenomenon that adolescents begin to consider things they'd always taken for granted. In the end, you may come to different conclusions than your parents, or your teachers, or your religion, or your culture. When we read a story just for a moral or a message, well, that's just someone else telling you what to think or what to do. And as we grow older, we often don't want to be told what to think or what to do. And you know, by now, you have experienced enough of life to know that things in our lives do not always tie up nicely with a bow. And I think as we get older, we long for storytelling that is more realistic, more like the world in which we live, where things in our lives often do not come to tidy conclusions that lead to a clear and simple moral of the story that lights our way forward. So what is the power of story then, if not to give us morals and messages? Ancient religions and ways of knowing understood the importance of story. Jesus, for example, spoke in parables rather than simply saying what he meant in a more straightforward way. Why? I don't know, but I suspect it is because he understood the power of story and its effect on an audience. You don't have to be religious to understand the power of story, though. Israeli historian Yuval Harari, in his best-selling *Sapiens: A Brief History of Humankind*, argues from an evolutionary perspective that it is our ability to use language and tell stories that has enabled us to move from the middle of the food chain to the top. Story has enabled us to create common beliefs and to work together at a scale previously unseen in a species on Earth. Let me ask you, will you have a happy life? How do you know? Is being happy simply a result of having a lot of money? There are plenty of rich people in the world who are miserable, you know. Some even commit suicide. Obviously, I'm not suggesting that attaining wealth leads to suicide. I'm just questioning the common assumption in popular culture that money makes you happy. If this were always true, why do we see rich people who are miserable? In any event, how do you know you will have a happy life? Fiction, stories, can actually help us achieve happiness and meaning in our lives. What? How? Fiction is a kind of simulation, the opportunity to consider different paths that we could take, decisions we might make, and how we might respond to events, both good and bad, that are outside of our control. Fiction is a chance to see consequences play out before us. Now, we obviously cannot control everything that happens to us in our lives, and we cannot control the fact that we will one day die, but that still leaves plenty of things we can control. Reading gives us a chance to play out different scenarios with relatively little danger, and these fictional scenarios may come to influence the decisions we make and how we live our actual lives. Actually, when you think about it, The IB Learner Profile is a kind of map to self-actualization, that is, becoming the best version of ourselves. To be a healthy, fulfilled person who achieves her or his potential, we want to be curious, principled, open-minded, balanced, etc. But another question. Will you make the world a better place? How do you know? It may sound crazy, but we could understand the IB Learner Profile as an answer to the question, how can we make the world a better place? As soon as this video is over, I'm going to ask you to engage your reading, your novel, in terms of the learner profile. I would argue becoming the best version of ourselves and making the world a better place are two important aims of education. And that brings us to this unit. Our statement of inquiry, engaging diverse perspectives, can tell us who we are, open our minds to other cultures and identities, and help us to become better versions of ourselves.